In terms of competition, China does not have as heavy of a military burden as the United States either, so more of their tax money can go to support the developing countries. I still didn't spell détente right, I guess. In the 1960s, President Nixon, through Henry Kissinger, set up a meeting where he went to visit China. Before that, China was almost a closed country. Nobody knew anything about it. This was called détente, which means easing of tensions, whether it's spelled right or not. And it led China away from Soviet-style economics to a more free market development. It opened communications with China, allowed them to study our economic systems, and China now has a combination of a communistic one-party system and a free market development system. Xi Jinping implemented economic reforms in the 80s to allow self-sufficiency, to be able to increase export capabilities. More important, China has a social culture that actually supports a lot of large corporate business ethics. Part of China's social culture is altruism. They have a social cognition, which really makes them aware that they're part of a larger unity. They have equity in many aspects of their culture. They have a strong belief in equality. They have egalitarian motives. They want things to be better for everyone. They, not everybody, but this is just the culture. They have a culture of public service. People give back. And they have a culture that economic growth is good. So you work hard and you achieve something. So their culture is also quite focused on economic development and development in a socially responsible way. In the United States, in 1983, they looked at the National Cooperative Research Act. And the United States government basically funds research. It funds research at different levels, but it still mostly funds research. It doesn't fund a corporation to develop a product. But India might, China might, our competitors might. Japan certainly does. So the NCRA was trying to refine the definition of antitrust in the United States to allow corporations to cooperate. I want to talk about the Naval Research Laboratories research efforts under the Office of Naval Research, ONR. And I want to do it simply to describe the different levels of research. So if you get a grant from ONR, from the Navy, and it's from 6.1 money, that means it's basic research. There's no hint of a product down the line, nothing. You're simply trying to do something new and innovative. If you get 6.2 money, then it's almost basic research, but it's been selected because that basic research might have applications for something the Navy needs. By the time you're at 6.3, and I'm not sure how high it goes, by the time you're at 6.3, the Navy Research Lab is looking for you not to do anything that they'll actually use, but to be demonstrating prototypes of things that they might use. 6.4, they might be actually looking at you developing some kind of a software that they might have an interest in. By 6.5, or somewhere around here, these numbers are a little vague in my brain because it's been a while since I got NRL funding. 6.5 or something like that. Now we're looking at actually transitioning a product from research over to implementation for the Navy. So the United States government, in many ways, NSF mostly does basic research. National Science Foundation, NRL, and the Air Force and other branches have similar things. Develop a spectrum of support a spectrum of research, but no direct corporate sponsorship. So the purpose for the NCRA, the 1983 adjustment to the antitrust laws, are to define a definition per se of what can be done and still isn't antitrust. So part of the act says the conduct of any person in making or performing a contract to carry out joint research and development shall not be deemed illegal per se by itself, and that such venture should instead be judged on the basis of reasonableness, taking into account all relevant factors affecting competition. In other words, it's not going to be antitrust just because the corporations are sharing information or sharing technology. It's going to have to be antitrust only if they're also dominating the market and using this to keep other competitors at bay. So the United States has had, especially after the passage of that law, several major consortiums. Some have succeeded better than others. We will talk about Semitech, U.S. Memories, and the General Motors Toyota consortiums. Before the General Motors Toyota consortiums, Nissan or Datsun was a more popular foreign car from Japan. After this consortium, Toyota became by far more popular. Symantec were semiconductor manufacturers, and they were facing competition from Japanese companies that were flooding U.S. markets below cost because the Japanese government would fund the difference. So this was a semiconductor manufacturing, you can see it, Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Initiative. It included 14 chip companies and the U.S. government. The chip companies included IBM, National Semiconductor, HP. I would think Intel was in there, but I can't say that for sure because I didn't write it down. My mistake. The U.S. government paid for some of the structure for the consortium. And the problem with this consortium is what the U.S. government wanted was for those chip companies to make chips specifically for the military. The companies joined because they wanted to be able to compete with Japan. But they were consistently being driven away from products that might be competitive at the marketplace. And instead, I'm not going to say badgered, but coerced into designing chips specifically for the government. Another issue here is that these chip manufacturers had different agendas. And for consortiums to work, it appears that you want to have a nice connection and a nice focus for the different companies to be able to move sort of in the same direction. So this consortium struggled, but they eventually succeeded. The consortium between GM and Toyota was a result of the 1979 oil crisis. I am quoting a song to you from the only people I know who sing it are Manhattan Transfer, but it's a song about 1979, and it says, the Shah of Iran tried so hard to survive. He too was wanted, dead or alive. So anyhow, the Shah of Iran was kicked out of the country, and a religious group took over instead. And that caused some problems with OPEC. OPEC stopped shipping as much oil to the United States, and there was an oil crisis. The U.S. domestic car manufacturers were not making small fuel-efficient cars, and Japan was. Worse than that, they couldn't make them cheap. They could make them, and they actually had plans and were pumping out a few, but they were $1,000 more than it cost the Japanese automakers to make and ship their cars to the United States. But the small fuel-efficient cars were the only ones we could afford to drive that year. So everyone traded in their big old U.S. cars, and the percentage in the United States jumped to 22% foreign car sales, 50% new car sales in California. In '79, Chrysler was saved by the U.S. government from bankruptcy with a bailout with a huge loan to be able to refocus their model. But the major problem was they didn't know how to build smaller cars cheaper than Japan. So GM wanted to partner with Toyota because they wanted to learn how they built them cheaper. And Toyota was constrained by import laws to only be able to sell so many of their cars in the United States. They could only ship so many in per year. Toyota wanted to be able to sell more cars. In order to do that, they had to build them in the United States. So Chrysler was saved by the government from bankruptcy in '79 with a bailout, and then they actually did reorganize themselves in 2009. Their prices were too high. Let me say this again. What caused Chrysler to have such a crisis? Besides the oil problems, the labor prices were high, interest rates were high, they had falling sales because of competition, they had made the wrong investments in small versus large vehicles, and they had machine tools still that were not automated. They had presses that, sorry about that. They had presses that stamped only certain designs of cars, and you had to retool that whole machine tool to move to another car. So nowadays, our machine tools in the car industry are much nicer. They are configurable. Back then, they were fixed. If you wanted to build a new car, you had to redesign the whole manufacturing line. They were losing money, so their debt was downgraded, which means they're paying even higher interest rates, and they couldn't compete with the international competition. Ford just avoided bankruptcy. Most important, 300,000 auto workers were laid off in 1980. Don't forget, Google employs 89,000 people. This is 3.5 times the number of employees of Google. At the time before this crisis, GM was the leading industrial company in the world. So once again, GM could not make a car as cheap as Japan, and Japan was limited by an import agreement. Lee Iacocca, the person who's credited with saving Chrysler, opposed this GM-Toyota agreement. He felt it would lead to the United States losing the ability to compete in this country, and we're facing sort of that again right now. The U.S. government invested in it, and they built a Toyota Corolla geoprism plant. The Toyota Corolla was the Corolla was Toyota's version, and the Prism was GM's. And they were essentially the same car. But by this time, United States manufacturers had a bad reputation for small cars, and so this car sold, the Prism sold for $1,000 less than the Toyota.